don't even think of biosecurity as a discipline. It's a multidisciplinary area where we're dealing with, say, insects and plant pathogens, if we're talking plant biosecurity. But then you can be doing everything from risk modelling. You could be in economics. You could be in social science. You could be bringing artificial intelligence into it. You could be bringing robotics into it. You could be bringing chemistry if we're looking at new control methods. So there's a myriad of areas that you could go and engage in.
Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of food systems. It's produced by the Sunderland Foundation Innovation Lab at Kansas State University. Welcome back to our hosts, Dr. Marina Lovnik, known for her leadership at the American Institute of Baking International, and more recently as coordinator of global food systems at Kansas State University, and Dr. Brian McCornick, professor and department head for entomology and a co-director of the Institute for Digital Agriculture and Advanced Analytics at Kansas State University. In an era of transformative global shifts, defined by evolving commodity trade patterns, the rise of online shopping, and economic challenges, a critical reevaluation of biosecurity strategies is imperative. Collaborative efforts through international partnerships, innovative approaches in business and technology, and the integration of multidisciplinary methods are essential for ensuring food security and forging novel pathways to combat pests and pathogens. Join us in this episode of Something to Chew On as we delve into these crucial topics with Simon McKirdy, Professor of Biosecurity, Deputy Vice Chancellor of Global Engagement, and Pro Vice Chancellor of the Harry Butler Institute at Murdoch University. A Fullbright Distinguished Chair and Life Sciences Award recipient, Dr. McKirdy's exploration of biosecurity system resiliency, coupled with his ongoing collaboration with K-State's Biosecurity Research Institute and Department of Plant Pathology, helps to establish policies and future frameworks for international coordination and global food security.
Well, I would like to welcome Dr. Simon McKirdy to the podcast today and really look forward to the discussion. Dr. McKirdy, could you give us a little background on yourself, professionally, personally, if you'd like, and how you entered into the field of study that you're in?
Yeah, look, thank you for that. I've had a interesting journey. I first trained as a plant pathologist, so very much a field-based pathologist out in the field, epidemiology. And while I enjoyed that, I was always looking for the next exciting bit. And through sort of the mid-90s, there was a growing movement in Australia around biosecurity, and very much that, how do we protect our agricultural crops from sort of the growing surge of new pests and pathogens that were arriving, and each one having a potential to have quite a significant impact on our production. And I was part of the sort of that initial movement in Australia that really focused on that. And in moving into that, I sort of felt that I moved from being I was actually in virology is where I had started, but I went from being virology to general pathology to being someone who was looking across insects and pathogens, but very much looking at it from the biosecurity perspective of, how do these things actually enter the country? What do we need to do at the border to stop them getting there? If they do get detected, how do we find them? How do we respond? And then through time also, how do we manage all the other areas that associate with biosecurity? And a lot of it's how do we manage the social issues around farmers and others in the production line who have to deal with these things, the management of large teams in government agencies or universities that have to manage the incursion responses. So through that, I got involved with a company in Australia called Plant Health Australia. Plant Health Australia is a very, very different, unique company in that it was actually set up by the Australian government, all the state governments, and all the plant industries. And its primary role is to lead policy development, but also the general structure around how Australia deals with new organisms, pests or pathogens entering the country. And I'll jump forward a little bit. I've actually been fortunate. I actually worked with them, and now I've actually come back nearly 20 years later. I'm now a director on the board of Plant Health Australia and following that through. So after my time with Plant Health Australia, I was also part of a group that led to the development of what's called a cooperative research centre for plant biosecurity in Australia. And I was the CEO of that for just over 8 years. And that was a really unique opportunity to bring together researchers right across Australia. But importantly, that was my link with Kansas State University. And through some early discussions more than 15 years ago with the president at the time, Kirk Schultz, that we drew up a partnership where Kansas State became part of that CRC. And that was a really important step and a really important part for the Australian program, in that we brought in a key player internationally in the field of biosecurity. And it started a long-term partnership I've had with the university in working with experts here on how we improve both our knowledge but also our understanding and our ways to deal with biosecurity issues. From the CRC, I took a very interesting left turn, as some people would say, and I actually went and worked for a large multinational in Chevron. And most people would say, what's the link between a large oil and gas multinational and biosecurity? It just doesn't seem to have a natural fit. But what was interesting was that despite people always sort of looking at the oil and gas companies as being the almost the ogre of the world these days because of fossil fuels, it was actually that Chevron were building a large LNG operation in Australia, in Western Australia, my home state. And they actually wanted to build this on an island that was off the coast. And through the negotiations with the government, they identified that they needed to protect the biodiversity of this island. And the way to do that was to have a very strong and sort of well laid out biosecurity program that enabled them to build a gas plant, operate a gas plant, but at the same time protect the biodiversity that was on that island. And to this day, having been in this field for a long time and viewed what's happening around the globe, there is probably not a biosecurity system that works as effectively or has had as good an outcome as has been achieved there. And a lot of the learnings and the technology that came out of the early investments by Chevron, I'm now seeing slowly being filtered into the broader applications globally. So that was a really exciting time in working with them. But it also led to me moving from Chevron to a university. And at the time with Chevron, one of the key drivers for how they set up the program and operated was a famous West Australian called Harry Butler. Harry was a naturalist and an educator, but Harry had this very strong view that, as he said, I will get a lot more out of talking with big companies about how they protect the environment than by chaining myself to a bulldozer and holding up a placard. And he said, there is a way for industry and biodiversity to work together, coexist, and for us to get outcomes as humans. We're going to keep developing, but at the same time, we've got to protect the environment around us because it's probably what will save us in the long term. So while I was with Chevron and we were looking at sort of the future of science to support the company and others, we made the decision, and we were fortunate that Chevron supported it, was we set up the Harry Butler Institute at Murdoch University in Western Australia. And so I transferred from Chevron to the university to lead that institute. And we're now 7 years down the track, and it's been operating very effectively. It's had some really great outcomes. And biosecurity is a really key part of that institute. And again, I've now made a slightly different change in direction again, and that now I'm in the position of being Deputy Vice Chancellor Global Engagement for the university, which in US terms is Vice President of International Programs. I still run the Harry Butler Institute 1 day a week, but it does give me the opportunity now to look at how, as a university, we build our international linkages, both with students in education but also in the fields of research. And I'm fortunate to be here at the moment on a Fullbright fellowship, where I've been, working with a close colleague, Dr. Jim Stack, on some key biosecurity projects that we've been working on for more than 15 years.
You just answered a couple of questions that I had on my list here. That was great. There are a couple of things I'm going to clarify for the listeners. LNG that you were working with Chevron, that is liquid natural gas, I assume.
Yes.
And
yes.
The other thing that I wanted to clarify, you mentioned CRC a couple of times. What is that?
So CRC is Cooperative Research Centre. Okay. It's an Australian government program with joint funding between government and industry. Great. Yeah. Just a quick kickoff question beyond what you laid out. Thank you so much for the overview. I was curious to understand, this question's probably bigger than we could talk about in the next 10 hours, but how does international biosecurity work? This is something where you're studying it in Australia and you got your hands around it there, and Jim and others are studying it here. How do you make those links to get these programs rolling? I don't think biosecurity can work unless we do it from an international perspective, because in the main part we're dealing with pests and pathogens that aren't currently in a country or a region. So we've got to be looking across the border where they are and how they're surviving, how they're moving. And it's that intelligence we gather by having those international linkages and understanding what are the pests and pathogens causing particular issues in particular regions at a particular time. That means we've got the best chance of having a high level of preparedness. If it's in Australia, we have a high level of preparedness because we're out there listening and understanding what's happening elsewhere in the world.
So can you maybe provide an example of where a partnership has really advanced biosecurity within Australia? I know you mentioned the CRC in partnership with Kansas State, but I mean, why at that point, why Kansas State, and then what's really come from that partnership since? Is it Jim Stack? Is it really just about Jim Stack? Is that
No doubt.
No doubt.
Yeah, look, Jim he was a key part, and in the first meeting I had to engage with Kansas State was through Jim Stack. But no, I think, if we just look here, I think it's the fact that there is such a focus of biosecurity here in Kansas, and particularly here at Kansas State University. The bit I've always really liked about engaging with here is that the expertise that sits here, and Brian, you're one of those, it's very much looking at the field-based side of biosecurity, the need for us to have that preparedness in place, and looking across the full spectrum of biosecurity issues from, risk assessment to border to diagnostics to surveillance to response to recovery, that is a really good link with how we operate. And I think, having spoken with people in many countries around the world about biosecurity, I find, the experts here, and I say the US in general, work and think very similar to how we operate. And New Zealand I put in there as well, which is quite different to how many other countries around the world handle biosecurity. In many ways, it's driven by our geographical positions and also the focus we have on agriculture and trade that really drives the way we think about biosecurity.
Does the the difference in approach to handling biosecurity in other parts of the world cause challenges in the way Australia and the U.S. approaches it? If you're looking at differences in trying to solve these problems, how do you get past some of those differences if they don't align with one another?
Yeah, I think obviously Europe is has a big challenge. There's lots of countries with no way to control borders, so they look at it quite differently to how we do. I mean, Australia in particular looks at it quite differently to the US, in that we have this benefit of being a large island mass with no common borders with anyone else. It does make life a little bit easier in terms of managing it. But I think the main linkage and the main benefit we get in working with US colleagues is that thinking and sort of general preparedness. It lets us think about where are the high risk areas around the globe that we need to be thinking about. How do we manage that new insect that may be becoming an issue in another country that may move here? And a good example of that at the moment is the wheat blast research that's being done here at Kansas State, an issue in South America that is quite significant and represents a really high potential risk for wheat production here in the US, but also for us in Australia. Like here, wheat is a significant crop for us back in Australia. It's a disease that's now appeared in the subcontinent. So, that working in partnership here to look at where it's appearing and what it's doing, how to diagnose it is, key for us in being best prepared to, one, stop it getting in, but also if it did get in, how do we manage it?
I'm kind of curious by the example you brought up with Chevron. What was special about that particular, I don't know if it was necessarily a project or initiative that it seems like it advanced the plant biosecurity kind of world forward. What was different about that particular approach?
So the biggest thing with that one was, it's probably the first time it's ever happened anywhere, is that there was an area in the world where a decision was made, do not introduce a single new organism to that island. Now, as a statement, it's probably, it sounds like, oh, yes, it's great, we can stop everything coming in. But in reality, it's a very hard task to stop anything coming in. But it did mean that in developing that project, there had to be a lot of rethinking about how do you actually manage the movement of huge amounts of cargo and lots of commodities into a single port in a short period of time. And I think one of the biggest learnings from that project, which has a lot of relevance to how we operate as a country now, is that I feel one of the biggest challenges is we often get caught in the focusing on a particular pest when we look at biosecurity. So take wheat blast. If we just focus all our efforts at the border on one disease or one insect, it's very likely that the other insect we didn't think about is the one that's going to arrive, and then we're going to find it in the paddocks, and then we're going to go, what do we do now? And it creates, a level of tension, and we've got to invest a lot of funds. The Chevron work, and it brought together a lot of key people who really thought a lot about this, really took that away and said, actual fact, let's forget about focusing on a specific insect or a specific pathogen. Let's actually develop the system that will stop most things coming in. And it's really changed a way of thinking about how we manage at the border. And there were some more other really big outcomes for it. One was around fumigation systems. And that was, we in all countries, we fumigate a lot of materials that come across borders for, taking out insects. Chevron looked at it and were investing significant amounts of money into fumigation, and they were using a lot of the common fumigants, which have a lot of, not only negative environmental impacts, but, from a occupational health and safety perspective, exposing workers to a lot of things. So they really pushed and invested in how do we develop a new fumigation system that not only is environmentally friendly, but very importantly is very safe for all of our workforce, works quickly and is also cost effective. That worked very well. There is a new fumigation system they've been using for many years, and that's starting to roll out into commercial use in a broader way. And I think without the investment that came and the thinking that was put in by Chevron early on, I don't think we would be seeing that fumigation system operating now. And we'd probably still be waiting in 20 years' time for, our normal cycle of research and thinking to go into how do we develop and what should we develop as the next treatment. So they're just two examples where I think there has been some really positive learnings from what was a significant project.
Interesting. The Chevron question we'll keep on the table for a minute because it's a very interesting one, and it seems to offer a lot of potential. But I'm curious as to know how frequently do you think this kind of interaction can happen? I mean, I assume it's a one-off at this point in time. Is that something you see as possible in a broader sense with other companies, with somehow coming up with a way of bringing that research? I have on my notes policy, but I think it's more on the research side. Do you see the potential of bringing those together in a bigger way?
Yes, I do. And I think if I've got a wish list for the remainder of my career, I'd love to see and it probably doesn't need to be anywhere near the extent that happened in this particular case with Chevron, but to have other big companies very much viewing biosecurity as a key part of how they operate, particularly when they're going into vulnerable and new ecosystems. I think it's going to be critical. And I think, if we stay true to Harry Butler, who, at the Institute's named after our university, that was very much his mission. And through time, I've seen some other companies that are doing it. We've recently had engagement with some other companies overseas, and I know people are looking at it. But, as I said, it's my life mission. I hope it does become more of a common part of how we operate, because I think it's going to be positive for the companies. I think, Chevron, in looking back, would see that having invested in this has actually brought a lot of other, company positives to the how they operate. And I think, other companies would find the same benefits and the environment benefits as well.
So what about public perception about plant biosecurity? Do you feel like that's changed over the years? My first experience literally flying into Australia the first time was bins being opened up and flight attendants with insecticides going down the bins, and I sat back. I'm like, they're taking this very seriously. I've just never experienced that before. What do you think has maybe changed or not, and what does that look like even moving forward?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'd say that I'm not sure the general population really has grabbed hold of biosecurity. So even that experience you had in the past in Australia, which you don't see anymore.
No.
So
this
now,
was a long time ago.
Yeah, so that's that's not there. I don't think people really grab hold of it. And I think one of the biggest challenges is people don't associate the food they eat every day with a paddock and a producer and all the challenges they go through in terms of actually having to plant, grow and harvest a crop, with the myriad of pests and pathogens that they deal with on a daily day, and the fact that letting another one in actually means that the challenge for that grower actually takes the next step up. So I think, despite, Australia probably having been one of the leading places for biosecurity over many years now, and, if you think it probably really started back in the early 90s, I still don't think we've got to a point where we've actually got the general community on board, because it's sort of an intangible it's out there, and for some people it's just a hassle that they have to go through when they come through the airport, but it's probably the last time they actually think about it.
How can we change that? It seems like it's such an important part. I mean, even like you were talking about, there are existing pests, and sometimes it's a struggle to be like, you need to be looking for things, and a lot of times it turns up as zero. So there's a lot of time invested in finding nothing being a good thing, but then this uncertainty of like what could be here at the same time can completely literally change a landscape. And that was sorghum aphid for us several years ago, where 40% reduction in sorghum acreage because of one aphid reintroduction, because they're completely scared about that. It's like, to me, that's maybe an opportunity to maybe learn from what can happen if you don't have resilient systems. But I'm just kind of curious, because it seems like the private-public partnerships are very important to Australian production. Chevron being one example. You mentioned a couple of examples earlier. But I do want to back up just for a moment, because to me, plant protection and biosecurity are maybe, well, I think they're different. I think they're different, but maybe for the listeners, maybe talk a little bit about like what is the difference between plant protection and biosecurity, or maybe there is no difference.
Yeah, no, and I think you've identified a really important thing there, and it probably has been one of the hardest things for us in getting general community to buy into it is, what does biosecurity mean? And I think, unfortunately, you probably, as you go from country to country, the definition changes a bit. And so, while I'm talking biosecurity here today, I think my definition is very similar to others here, but they all differ in one way or another. Plant protection, as you point out, I'd see that as being different again. So for my definitions, for biosecurity, I see biosecurity in a simple way as being, how do we deal with the entry, establishment and spread of new organisms into a new region, area, country. Plant protection I see as being, once those pests or pathogens are established, how do we manage them in our production systems or our natural ecosystems on a year-by-year basis? But I think, to me, that makes sense. But to me, if I think of it,
I agree with you. It makes sense to me.
Present that to the general community, that may not be an easy one to differentiate and then to be clearly understood. And maybe, I know people have talked about maybe the word biosecurity is part of our challenge, that, people don't really grab hold of it. And I think having just gone through COVID, if COVID did anything negatively for us, it was that it's actually blurred the definition of biosecurity even more when we talk plant biosecurity, because people now just see it as that's the human pandemic and managing a human disease that was, working its way around the globe.
Yeah, the idea of regulated species and what can happen when you find a regulated species in, your own, like you say, paddock. It's a real thing. At the same time, like you're talking about the future of a commodity, and maybe several commodities depending on the invasive species that might have 30 host plants that it's particularly attacking. So it's one of those where I think public education is always going to be part of it. But yeah, the words we choose to use and how we get people excited about it in the right ways to advance either the technologies or what have you forward is definitely part of it.
So I think one of the other, and, we're fortunate to live in the countries we do, Australia and the US, the word food insecurity for an individual really doesn't exist in most cases. For most people, they can see a meal being put in front of them 3 times a day. Actually thinking about how important it is in the process of getting that food there never actually goes through the head of the most people in our communities. So to me, because they don't do that, there's without really thinking about the farming system and everything that goes into that to enable that food to actually get there, makes it very difficult, and it doesn't put it on a priority list for the average person that's out on the street.
Agree with that. I'm going to take that same line of questioning to a little smaller audience. Where do you see the level of student interest in this kind of activity? And I'm guessing that, in agricultural focuses, there's an understanding and a level. I'm answering my own question. Where do you see the level of student interest, and does it go beyond just food research? Do you see others at the universities that you work in that are starting to get a grasp of what this is about just within that area?
Yeah, I think we, and I've very much talked from my experiences back in Australia, that, there is still a good level of interest there in student numbers. Obviously, we'd always like to see more. I think and this is something I always try to do in talking with students, is to point out that biosecurity actually gives you the opportunity to look at many disciplines. And in some ways, I've actually said, don't even think of biosecurity as a discipline. It's a multidisciplinary area where we're dealing with, say, insects and plant pathogens, if we're talking plant biosecurity. But then you can be doing everything from risk modelling. You could be in economics. You could be in social science. You could be bringing artificial intelligence into it. You could be bringing robotics into it. You could be bringing chemistry if we're looking at new control methods. So there's a myriad of areas that you could go and engage in to focus on, that particular insect. Or you could go and do some basic taxonomy, which again that's probably an area that we are finding a real gap and hasn't got a lot of excitement around it now. But I think the fact that we can tackle it from that perspective, and particularly in graduate students now, I always encourage them to think about, if they're going to go into a plant biosecurity project, is to think about how you can bring some other disciplines into your project, and don't just think of it as, I'm looking at, a particular insect, and if I'm doing taxonomy, don't just think of it from that perspective. Think about how can I bring some AI into the project to help me with doing the diagnosis, or can I bring an economic or a social science perspective into what I'm doing? And to me, that gives a student a much broader base of knowledge when they're finished, but it also helps in them getting a better appreciation for what biosecurity is.
And I agree wholeheartedly that the example you gave sounds a bit like a one-off perspective. So you're working with a student and a student. Is there a way to broaden that interest level from university-wide without going one student by one student, to say, okay, how do we get this as something that the university focuses on? I mean, they just came out with a strategic plan for K-State recently. Is that where something like that fits, or are there other programs that would elevate the importance of this with students overall?
Yeah, look, I'll just give a perspective from Australia. Biosecurity as an undergraduate course doesn't exist, and it's very much it's more focused at the graduate end of actually bringing students that have gone through, showing some interest in an area, and then focusing them in a graduate program. I'm not sure that having a focus in undergraduate is really needed. I think as long as where our core programs are foundational at the undergraduate level, then we're going to get the students coming through that we can then plug into our graduate programs, which are, to me, critical in us, building that next generation of biosecurity experts, both, industry and government, but also in academia.
So at what point did you make that decision to devote a lot of your career into plant biosecurity? Like, you think about, I agree with Maureen's question about providing that student experience. Once you have that, it's really hard to give that back. You own that forever. So can you think about your own kind of, you talked about your pathway, but was there a specific incursion? Was there something you're like, I have to do something about this? What can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, Ashfat, it's a really good question, because it was that sort of, as we say, the aha moment that sort of focused me there. I went through and did, an agricultural science degree and focused, and, then I did a PhD where I focused on plant virology, but from a field epidemiology perspective. It wasn't until I actually was out working, and I was working in the Department of Agriculture in Western Australia, and it was a grapevine disease, which actually turned out not to be a disease, but it was a syndrome called Mundella yellows, and it was actually going out and actually talking to farmers and as pathologists trying to identify what it was and where it might have come from, and because I was there as that early stage of biosecurity and starting to see the challenges that the vineyard owners were going through at the time of having something new just suddenly appear in their vineyards that was having a significant impact, and that strong focus on how do we get back to where we need to be in terms of managing all of this. That's what really sort of sparked me and said, no, actually, in fact, I see the value in this biosecurity, and if I'm going to do it, to be involved in something that's actually giving value back to that grower on the ground to help him get through these, what can be quite serious impacts.
That got me thinking about my own, and it was soybean aphid, same thing. I swore off academia and a PhD after my master's, and then came back to Minnesota, and soybean aphid came on the scene and was one of those things where, growers are crops being devastated and species completely out of control and looking for answers. And it was just one of those moments this can't be the only thing we're going to deal with in broad acreage agriculture. So we have to have, and I don't like you were saying with the biosecurity background, I'm just a trained entomologist and field crop IPM, but a lot of those same kind of principles can apply to new species that are not here. So I do have a follow-up question though, and I mean this in the nicest way possible. Why plant pathology? So what actually got you sparked into going down the plant pathology route?
That's a long time ago.
I know. We have a lot of time. We can edit this out. What's the?
We're good.
I think, it was one of those things that I think I was fortunate growing up in that I had while I lived in a city, I had a family that, relatives that had a dairy farm. So it was that common time for us in going, particularly through high school, where you'd finish school and you'd pack up and you'd either hop on the train or get driven down, and you'd spend the school holiday break on the farm. And, that was like the highlight of the year and engaging with that. So I think I got that sort of farming bug, and my wife will still tell you today that I'm a pent-up farmer inside. Everything I do is about producing something, and I can tell you about what I do at home in terms of growing stuff, and it's probably a bit over the top, but it's that, that farmer mentality. And, I think, I always say that uncle of mine really sort of instilled in me a lot of really important learnings about how you operate a business and, what a farmer goes through. And I, always had a strong animal plant interest. And when I went to university, I went straight to agricultural science because that's what really interested me. And I think, I could have gone either way. I could have gone animals or plants. And it was actually a failure of a unit that directed me towards plants rather than animals. And I did my first biochemistry unit and I failed. I failed miserably. And so I had to repeat biochemistry, and which I passed second time round. But because I'd failed it the first time, it meant that a particular path in animals closed for me for the next year. I would have had to wait another year. So I went the plant avenue. So in reality, it was as simple as that. And even today, I mean, while I did plant pathology, you know, and the purest plant pathologists would probably, you know, they'd scorn at me saying this, but, you know, even in the end, I still feel like I'm a generalist. Plant pathology just taught me some really good principles in terms of, you know, managing an organism and an organism's relationship with another organism, which today I apply to, you know, insects. But, you know, I've been involved in aquatic biosecurity, environmental biosecurity with mammals. So I've now sort of become a bit of a general biosecurity person across all sorts of organisms, and plant pathology was just a great foundation that's allowed me to go in many directions.
That's an incredible message for students. I mean, it truly is. Looking at where you are today and what you went through, the fact that you totally bombed out, you failed,
but tried again,
came back around, and went down a path that's taken you to some really good levels and done some amazing things. So that's, again, a very good message for the students that might listen. Yeah.
I haven't thought about that for a long time. So that was a...
Well, it got me thinking when you were asking Maureen the question about, you know, developing programs and things like that. And to me, I feel like we have all the programs we need. It's really more in the way in which we think about those programs and think about the world that these students are going into and the kinds of experiences that they're going to come across. And yeah, can you take a foundational discipline like plant pathology or entomology, you name the ology, and then be able to apply that to something that is affecting trade across the world? And I'd say a lot of that, like you said, is just an interest, something that you can just align with.
Just jumping in, I mean, I've got a great example of a student back home who had done some science through an undergraduate, but her major was actually in art. Now, she's just completed a PhD in biosecurity, but she got very much into using a particular modelling system. But, you know, that skill she had and knowledge she'd built around art has actually proved valuable in her actually being able to do this PhD and to think about the modelling. So to me, it's a really good example of a student who may have thought they were in a completely different direction to now having completed. And, you know, I can see her being, you know, one of our key biosecurity experts, particularly in looking at modelling systems for many years to come.
That's great.
Another great message for students. Yeah. I mean, it truly is. Sometimes faculty does the same. We get it, and you know, we get our blinders on and say, okay, this is where we're going. And as soon as you take them off and start seeing what's possible, it's just a whole different. Well, this question I have is very broad, and we'll see what you come up with on it. What does the future hold on this? Where are we headed for?
Where are we headed in biosecurity, or from
where are we headed
farming systems?
Well, both. Let's open it wide up. Either or both. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question, and it's what I've spent the last 3 weeks actually putting a lot of thinking into with Dr. Jim Stack. You know, where are we at with our biosecurity systems? You know, where are our challenges? You know, we're in an interesting period. One, you know, our way of living has changed considerably. Our trade of commodities has changed considerably over the last 10 years. If you look at just the number of parcels through online shopping that are getting moved around the world, it's really changed how we think, the number of sea containers being moved. has changed considerably. We're also at a time when, economies are, a little bit shaky. Governments don't have the same resource base to invest in, protecting the borders as much as we'd all like. So it sort of raises some questions about, how do we think about how we manage these systems for the future? And, from my perspective, it does mean we're going to have to do some rethinking about where we invest. And my view is that we've got to look at the border a lot more seriously than we probably currently do. Because to me, let's stop the things getting in as much as possible. And nothing's zero, but if we can stop as much coming in as possible, then we don't have to have all of the on-ground response, which is often the costly end. But I also think we also have to rethink how we manage things once they arrive. And I do think we have to start questioning whether every time we detect something new, do we go in with a view that we've got to eradicate everything straight away? And I think, sometimes by going straight in and wanting to eradicate, we use a lot of resources, but we also create a lot of, I'll call it disturbance in the community. We sort of, we quarantine areas, we impact general community a lot, which I don't think helps us in the long run, and whether we need to come up with a viewpoint that if we do as much as we can at the border to stop things coming in, accepting that things will occasionally still get through, but once they get in, let's not all just go into let's actually think we're better off actually thinking how do we just go straight to management and make sure that from a management perspective, we're giving our industries the best chance to actually, live with this pathogen or pest for the future. And it's going to take a considerable amount of almost soul searching, I think, in governments to make that jump, because there's been this common mindset that we have to eradicate. And I think, again, I'll come back to the COVID example. I think COVID's another example where we as humans made an initial thing about everything was eradication. But I think if you look at all the places that went into eradication mode globally, it didn't work. A lot was invested. Those that probably went more into a management mode earlier on probably got a better outcome. And I think it has, particularly for myself, it's made me sit back and rethink just how do our systems operate and when to invest. And I think one of the other areas is we need to think about a lot more about how we can bring cost-effective new technology to play to help us deliver biosecurity. And I think we still haven't fully utilised the tools that are out there that can help us operate.
So what are some of those new technologies that you see as kind of either cutting edge or ones we haven't adopted but should, and like what's...
Oh, I think, when we, AI and robotics and other new, engineering solutions, I think it's not my area of expertise, but I do think we're not utilising that anywhere near as well as we should. But there is a caution that I put in there, and that when we go down these paths, we always have to be thinking of the cost effectiveness and time effectiveness of utilising this technology. Because I think one error I do see often is that we look at new technologies and we always want to go for the biggest and the best, and then we can invest a lot of funds into looking at those. But often it's the simpler end that's going to be very cost effective. And one of our challenges in biosecurity is because we're looking across the whole landscape, that spatial perspective means we often need to use technology in many areas. And the only way you can do that is if it's cost effective, and we're thinking at that end from the start.
So cost effective to governments or stakeholders, or like when you where does the ultimate cost?
So
where's that born?
well, when I say cost effective, I'm thinking of the whole system. So that's government and its industry and its community. Whoever is utilising that technology to get the outcome they're after, can they afford to invest in that and still be profitable, sustainable at the end?
Yeah. When I think cost effective, I'm thinking also of taking it down to the small farmers, the very, very small farmers, medium size, all the way to, so as technologies are developed, can they be developed on a cell phone that somebody may have out in a field in Mali or someplace like that that's still equally effective.
And I think and I've had a recent example of that. I think it's often hard for some of those that invest in these areas to appreciate the value that the technology would bring to play. I've recently been trying to push an idea with mobile phones for plant pathogen surveillance, and I think mobile phones in many ways are one of the best tools if we can work out how to use them, because everyone has them. They go everywhere. So in terms of, and if you think from surveillance and you think temporally and spatially, if you're thinking of a medium, then the mobile phone is probably the best of the lot.
I've said this on a past podcast, but on a trip a couple of years ago to Ethiopia, I remember driving through a small village that was a small Ethiopian village. I mean, there were mud huts and there were small animal holding pens and that type of thing around, and very little electricity available. But I've got a photograph of a gentleman sitting up against his wall on his cell phone, and I'm thinking, there's so much power in that could be used for the half quarter acre plot that they have. I don't know what that would be that they would use, but I'm sure that there's something that would be very effective. I guess one of the things that I'll step back to the question that I had asked on, the connection between corporate and the research. I used the word policy and then I dropped it quickly. Where does regulation and government intervention fit into some of these kinds of things? You talked about that in expanding the focus on the borders and product coming in and that type of thing. Is that the main area that the governmental bodies should be looking at?
No, look, I think even with the big corporations, I think government policy is critical there as well. Even with the Chevron project, it probably needed the government policy to emphasise the need to protect the area they were working in, which then mobilised the company in that direction. Without the government policy, would the company have done it? Probably not, even though now, today, they may change their view because, they did actually see a lot of positives come from in other areas in having done that. But I think it's that balance that government has to come to, and having the right policies to incentivise companies to engage in this without being too heavy-handed, which makes operations impossible. And I think that's one of the challenges that governments have with biosecurity. Just to add on to that, I think one of the, and it goes back to the Harry Butler mantra that he stood by, and a lot of there's a lot of discussion out there about how we have to change the way we live, and there's obviously a lot of there's groups that want to protest and challenge things, but the reality is that as humans, we're not going to turn around and go backwards. We're not going to go back to living in humpies with loincloths. So development's going to have to continue, even today with our, us wanting to go down the electric vehicle path in a big way. While we're removing the fossil fuel element, EVs means we need batteries, which means we need huge numbers of metals, which means the only way to get the metals is we have to dig big holes in the ground. And we're tending to do that in countries that probably don't have as good environmental laws. So, we could be just creating the next big challenge for the globe in 100 years' time by solving this one. But, and I'm going down that path to sort of point out that that's where government policy has to be right to talk about how we protect that environment today, and biosecurity is a key way to make sure we achieve that. So even if we do go down this path of, having more mines and digging up more of these precious metals that we need for the batteries, at the same time, we're doing our best to protect the environment and everything around us so that we're not leaving a legacy there for, 3-4 generations in the future.
So how do stakeholders stay engaged when it comes to policy? It seems like access to technology and what technologies we might implement maybe at a border or in a paddock or field is one part of it, but also like the regulations that go around when something comes in, what happens, how that impacts. You talked about livelihood. Like, how do they actually get involved? What's the call to action when it comes to just kind of your run-of-the-mill stakeholder listening to the podcast?
And I think this is one of it's that messaging that we need to get out to the general population. And I think, even when we look at where we are now here in Kansas, which is, largely surrounded by farming communities, it's a small part of the population. It's how do we actually get the big population areas, and it's usually the cities, people there to appreciate the huge value that agriculture and what farmers produce for the country, not only in terms of, economic value for the country, but also the fact that, that's the food, the sustenance that we rely on every day. And then also looking at the environment. I mean, that whole thing about, people love to go hiking, they want to get out into the natural ecosystems, but how many people actually ever think about the potential impact of a new insect or pathogen in the forest, trees dying? Since I've been here, I've heard some staggering figures on the number of tree deaths that are occurring in the US due to some particular beetles that are increasing their populations considerably. That challenge of how do we get that general population in the big cities, who really are the voting majority, to fully appreciate what this brings to them as individuals. Until we can achieve that, I think we're always going to be in this struggle. And I must say, it's not something I've really been able to come to an answer as to how we achieve it. But it's almost for those students out there that want to get into marketing, this could be a great project. How do we increase that, appreciation in our large populaces to understand the huge value of agriculture and the environment to the country as a whole?
So if you had to think in terms of maybe your top 3 to 5 species of concern that might help with some of that messaging that might impact people in these more urban areas, are there, I don't know, it's just, again, it goes back to the experiences, and once you have that experience, nobody can take that away from you. Is that one of those where, yeah, maybe not from the farming community where I might never visit versus something in my backyard where now I'm, really concerned about it and we need to do something, but that then also helps rural communities thrive in the unknown future of what invasive species might be coming?
So I've actually been really hard in focusing these days to say that I'm not actually going to talk about a specific pest as being a specific threat, because I think sometimes that's been our worst way of actually marketing the issue to population, because you may build something up and then it never happens, and then people go, "Oh, that wasn't really that exciting, so we are not going that part." To me, it's how do we market that? There are a lot of pests and pathogens out there around the world that we don't have yet in this area. And we don't want them to come in because, that farmer next door that you can see currently, he has, say he's growing wheat. We know he already has to spray, for example, 4 times a year to control the insects and the pathogens that he's got. He's probably spraying more than that. But he's already got that. And then that means not only have you got the costs of production, but, there's how many pesticides do you want sprayed on there? If we're going to let more things come in and more things establish, then that means there's going to be more spraying going on that crop. There's going to be more effort that the farmer has to put into. It could also mean that a particular crop gets removed from an area and you've got to bring a new crop in. So it's how we market that message is how I'm trying to portray it these days rather than hone in on that one specific.
But there's not a species that you're just personally concerned about. Like, because especially when you think of in terms of like market and trade, like there's something that, that is in the news. It's something that, just to be, again, just that awareness that things like this happen and that maybe there's already been an incursion. You know what I mean? Like there are things where we can at least bring that awareness. I agree, like not to say gloom and doom is coming. These are the top, but like what are some things that might help people understand that this really does happen? First of all, there's reasons to have protection at borders for these kinds of invasive species. Are there some maybe current case studies that we can maybe look at?
I think, there's that good example I spoke about earlier. I think wheat blast is a good example that, it.
And what is wheat blast? And why should we be concerned about that?
So wheat blast is a disease that's appeared in South America. It's obviously been there for a period. It's a disease that when it really does take off, it will destroy 100% of a wheat crop. And it does it very quickly. It's within a few days you can see a crop go from being productive to having no yield at all. And so in terms of impact of a disease, this is one that has, really high significance. And if you see where it's appeared and the fact that it's now appeared in Bangladesh, in a country that has some significant food issues, it's, starting to really, really impact. And, I think particularly, where I come from in Western Australia, wheat production is our major crop by a long way. Something like this would severely impact what's happening there. In terms of an insect, one for us back home, and I think it's a big issue still here, is capra beetle. It's a voracious little insect that's quite small but can eat a huge amount of grain in a very short period of time. That's one that we need to work on. Interesting, that is one that we've involved in a project back home on at the moment in looking at how we redesign seed containers to decrease the chance of capra beetle being moved from country to country in a seed container.
Very good.
Okay. I'm sure we could go for another hour or two. I'm getting the look from him. He's saying, I've got more questions.
No. This has been great.
No, this has been great. Thank you so much.
If you have questions or comments you would like to share, check out our website at lib.ksu.edu/innovation-lab and drop us an email. Our music was adapted from Wayne Goins' album, Chronicles of Carmela. Special thanks to him for providing that to us. Something to Chew On is produced by the Sunderland Foundation Innovation Lab at Kansas State University.